When Officer Ramirez and Dispatcher Kelly answered the frantic 911 call, they had no idea that what awaited them inside a quiet suburban home would haunt them for the rest of their lives. It was close to midnight when the rain began to fall harder, drumming against the thin glass of the emergency dispatch center. The room was filled with the usual hum of radios, keyboards, and faint chatter, but that calm rhythm was shattered when a call lit up one of the operator screens. The dispatcher answered in a steady tone, but what came through the line was anything but clear. A woman's voice shook with terror, her words breaking apart, rushing and then disappearing into sobs. She tried to explain, but her sentences tangled. There were fragments about someone being inside the house, about not being able to get out, about a door that wouldn't open. The dispatcher pressed for details, but each response was more fractured than the last. The fear in the woman's voice was so raw that even the experienced operator felt her hands tremble as she typed. The address finally came through, forced out between gasps. It was a suburban neighborhood known for its safety, the kind of place where residents left bicycles in front yards and kids played late into the evening. The call felt like a cruel distortion of the peace that street usually carried. The dispatcher relayed information to patrol units while keeping the caller on the line, hoping to maintain some sense of control. The woman kept repeating a phrase, almost chanting it, as though she believed saying it enough times might make it true. What she repeated wasn't a plea for help, but something more chilling. Words that made little sense in the moment, but would later become a clue. 2 patrol cars were already heading toward the scene, their lights cutting through sheets of rain. Officers inside had no idea what to expect. The dispatcher described the call as erratic, possibly linked to a domestic disturbance or break-in. But even in the vague details, something about it carried a weight of dread. It wasn't just the panic in the woman's voice. It was the sound behind her, muffled but present, like faint movement in the background, the creak of wood, or the dragging of something heavy. It was impossible to tell if it was real or interference on the line, but it froze the room in uneasy silence. As the officers approached the neighborhood, the streets appeared still, almost untouched by the storm. Porch lights flickered on quiet houses and parked cars glistened with water. Nothing suggested the chaos of the call. When they turned onto the listed address, the house looked perfectly normal. No broken windows, no lights flashing, no signs of forced entry. It was the sort of home that might appear on a postcard for suburban living. But the dispatcher's voice came sharply over the radio, reminding them that the call was still active, the woman still on the line, her breathing ragged and broken. She was inside, somewhere in that neat-looking home, and whatever had terrified her was likely still there too. The officers cut their sirens as they pulled up, stepping into the rain-soaked driveway with only their flashlights and radios breaking the silence. What had begun as an ordinary midnight shift was already unraveling into something far darker, and none of them could shake the feeling that once they crossed the threshold of that house, nothing would ever feel ordinary again. The officers moved cautiously toward the house, their boots squelching in the soaked grass, flashlights cutting through the darkness like thin blades. From the outside, everything seemed ordinary. The lawn was neatly trimmed, the porch lights glowed faintly, and the curtains swayed gently in the wind. Nothing hinted at the chaos they were about to encounter. Yet, an unshakable sense of unease settled over the squad. The quiet was wrong. It wasn't just the storm, it was a silence that felt deliberate, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to step inside. The front door appeared intact, though faint scratches marked the frame, nearly invisible in the dim light. The officers exchanged glances, the tension evident in the tight lines of their faces. Every step they took on the creaking porch amplified the ominous quiet. The dispatcher's voice over the radio reminded them that the caller was still inside, though her words had devolved into panicked murmurs. The officers could hear only fragments, something about a room, something about not moving, a repeated warning. It was impossible to form a clear picture, but the fear behind her voice was unmistakable. Inside, the house betrayed the appearance of normalcy. The living room was neat, the furniture in place, yet the air carried a faint, acrid smell that set the officers' nerves on edge. It was a mix of burnt food and something far more unsettling, a metallic tang that made the back of their throats tighten. They swept the main floor, their eyes scanning every shadow, every dark corner. Overturned chairs, a small table lying on its side, and scuffed footprints marred the polished hardwood, signs of a struggle that had taken place not long before. Each clue added to the mounting dread. This wasn't a break-in. This was intentional, chaotic, and cruel. The officers moved methodically, checking each door and room. The bedrooms were empty, closets stood ajar, and windows remained shut and locked. The only sound was the distant drum of rain against the roof and the occasional drip from a leaking pipe. Yet, the tension grew heavier with each step. It was the feeling of being watched, though no one could be seen. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways under the flashlight beams, and the officers instinctively paused, knowing instinctively that something, or someone, was ahead of them, waiting. Descending into the basement, the air grew colder and thicker, carrying a musty, suffocating odor. The stairs creaked under their weight, every step echoing ominously through the empty house. In the dim light, they saw signs that the struggle had intensified here. Broken furniture, splintered wood, and smudged fingerprints on the walls. The space felt alive, almost sentient, as though it were anticipating their presence. The officers advanced with extreme caution, their senses sharpened by years of experience, but unable to dull the unease gnawing at them. They knew, in that heavy silence, that whatever had happened in this house was far from over, and that the truth waiting below would be far darker than anything they had imagined. The basement was a dim, oppressive space, its low ceiling and narrow layout amplifying every sound. The officers moved slowly, flashlights cutting through the darkness, revealing a scene that seemed almost staged in its horror. Broken furniture was scattered across the concrete floor, splintered wood jutting up like jagged teeth. The smell hit them before they saw the first clue. A sharp, metallic tang that made their stomachs turn. The struggle that had occurred here was recent, and the air was heavy with the residue of fear. Every officer in the room felt it. A suffocating presence that pressed against their chests and whispered of things better left unseen. Then, in a far corner, they found the source of the call. A small figure, slumped and barely moving, chained to a metal frame, bolted into the wall. The victim's clothing was torn, their body weak from exhaustion and dehydration, and their breathing shallow. The officers immediately assessed the situation, knowing that time was critical. Medical aid was called, and one of the officers began carefully loosening the chains, all while keeping an eye on the shadows that seemed to shift with every movement of the flashlight. The victim's eyes opened briefly, revealing a look of terror that would not easily be forgotten, a silent plea for rescue that lingered far longer than the words could. Evidence of the perpetrator's meticulous planning became immediately apparent. Handwritten notes littered the floor, each one cryptic, some containing detailed instructions for the victim, others with strange symbols etched into the paper in a precise, deliberate hand. Photographs were scattered around, some showing the victim in previous locations, others depicting items from the house that the intruder had disturbed. It was clear this was no random act. Someone had studied both the environment and the people within it, mapping out each move with patience and intent. The officers felt a chill as they realized that every clue was designed not just to confuse, but to torment, leaving a trail that both led them to the victim and reminded them of the manipulator's control. As they worked to stabilize the victim, the officers noticed signs that the basement had been used in other ways as well. Marks on the walls suggested attempts to barricade or trap, and faint stains indicated other, earlier incidents that had gone undetected. It was as if the basement itself had become a container of fear, accumulating the echoes of previous victims and leaving a trace that clung to anyone who entered. The officers were aware of the psychological weight pressing down on them, an invisible force that made every shadow twitch and every sound more threatening. The house seemed alive, feeding on the terror it had created. By the time the victim was safely lifted from the basement and carried to the ambulance, the investigation had transformed. What began as a straightforward call had become a complex puzzle, each piece more disturbing than the last. The officers knew that the case would haunt them long after the physical evidence was catalogued. Even as they stepped back into the storm, leaving the basement behind, the weight of what they had witnessed lingered. Every creak of the house, every shadow in the corner of their vision, reminded them that the danger had not simply been neutralized. The perpetrator had left behind a psychological maze that would follow them, a chilling testament to a mind willing to orchestrate terror down to the smallest detail. The investigation quickly escalated beyond the confines of the house. Once the victim was stabilized and placed under protective care, detectives and forensic teams combed the property for additional evidence. Every scrap of paper, every fingerprint, and every photograph became a potential key to understanding the mind behind the nightmare. It was clear the perpetrator had studied law enforcement protocols, anticipating their actions and leaving just enough breadcrumbs to manipulate the investigation. Patterns emerged from the chaos, subtle repetitions that hinted at prior incidents. The realization settled over the team like a weight. This was not a single crime of opportunity. It was a carefully orchestrated series of events, likely spanning months, possibly years. Leads began to converge on one figure, someone who had blended into the community unnoticed, a neighbor or acquaintance whose presence had been benign at first glance. Detectives scoured public records, interviews, and surveillance footage, piecing together a timeline that revealed unsettling overlaps with other local disappearances. What was most unnerving was the precision with which the perpetrator had avoided detection. The locations, the timing, the victims, all had been carefully chosen to exploit gaps in oversight and public awareness. Officers felt the pressure of both urgency and dread. Each hour that passed without apprehending the suspect increased the risk of another victim. The detectives also discovered that the perpetrator had been leaving messages specifically for law enforcement, cryptic symbols and instructions that suggested a desire for control and recognition. Some notes were taunting, implying an intimate knowledge of the officer's movements and the investigation itself. It became evident that the perpetrator saw the entire city as a game board, positioning victims and clues to maintain dominance while staying several steps ahead. This realization brought an added layer of psychological strain to the team. Every decision, every lead followed, carried the weight of potential consequences, not just for them, but for anyone who could be targeted next. As the manhunt intensified, the city itself seemed to feel the tension. Neighborhoods were patrolled more heavily, residents grew wary, and ordinary activities took on a sinister undertone. The officers experienced sleepless nights, haunted not only by the images of the basement, but by the idea that the perpetrator could be anywhere, watching, waiting. The sense of urgency was compounded by the understanding that the suspect had already demonstrated a chilling ability to manipulate environments and people, leaving devastation in his wake while keeping authorities perpetually on edge. Eventually, a breakthrough came when a small, overlooked detail in one of the photographs matched a location under surveillance. The detectives moved quickly, coordinating multiple teams to close in on the suspect. Even as they approached, there was no certainty, only the grim knowledge that every moment counted. The suspect's methods had instilled a persistent unease. The officers knew that capturing him might not erase the fear he had sown. The hunt had become a psychological battle as much as a physical one, with the city itself caught in the shadow of a predator who had outsmarted the system at every turn. By the time the suspect was cornered, officers were not celebrating. They were relieved, but deeply aware that the nightmare's reach extended far beyond the house into the minds of everyone involved. The arrest of the suspect brought a sense of relief, but it was far from the end of the ordeal. The psychological impact of the case lingered long after the handcuffs clicked shut. For the officers who had first answered the 911 call, the images of the basement, the chained victim, and the chaotic evidence remained vivid in their minds. Every time they closed their eyes, the fragments of that night replayed. Shadows stretching across the walls, the metallic tang of the air, the sound of the caller's panicked voice echoing in the silence. Sleep became fragmented and ordinary routines felt foreign, as if the world outside the investigation had shifted irreversibly. The community struggled to recover as well. News of the crime spread quickly, sensationalized by media outlets, leaving residents in a state of fear and suspicion. People locked doors more tightly. Children were kept indoors after dark, and neighbors eyed one another with wariness that had never existed before. Even those who had never interacted with the victim or the suspect felt the ripple effect of the terror, a reminder of how fragile safety could be. The house itself became a focal point of collective unease. Though the basement was sealed off and investigators had collected every piece of evidence, locals still avoided the property, unwilling to step near a place that had held so much darkness. The victim faced a long road to recovery, both physically and emotionally. Medical care restored their body, but the mental scars ran deeper. Nightmares, hypervigilance, and a pervasive sense of danger became part of daily life. Therapy sessions helped, but memories of being chained, the dim light of the basement, and the manipulative presence of the perpetrator lingered. Even in moments of calm, the mind would return to the fear that had defined those hours. For the officers, the trauma was different, but no less significant. They were haunted not only by what they had seen, but by the realization that human cruelty could be so deliberate, calculated, and invisible until it struck. The case became a permanent reference within the police department. New recruits were shown the photographs, the layout of the house, and even snippets of the original 911 recording as a cautionary tale. It was not only a story of procedural success, but also a reminder of vulnerability. Officers learned to respect the unpredictability of emergencies, to trust instincts, and to acknowledge the emotional toll that such calls could take. Even years later, the phrase, "This 911 call would forever haunt officers," was spoken with a weight that carried both fear and respect. Despite the resolution, the memory of the case lingered like a shadow over everyone involved. The city gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the collective consciousness had been altered. Every late-night call, every strange sound, every sudden knock at the door carried a fraction of the tension from that night. The officers, the victim, and the community had survived, but survival did not erase the mark left by fear, control, and cruelty. Some calls changed lives forever, and this one had done exactly that, leaving an indelible imprint on every mind it touched, a haunting reminder that danger could lurk where it was least expected, waiting for the unsuspecting to answer.